Professor Dan Slater to deliver his keynote address. Goodbye, USA, Southeast Asia After American Liberalism, live from Berlin to the stage of Park Royal Collection, Kuala Lumpur. Take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I feel like I should come out as a boxer or something. That was a very rousing introduction. Well, it's a delight to be able to rejoin my friends and colleagues at Ideas again. Um, Ba'ara and Masudi and others who've been a big help in getting this all set up. I'm just very sorry I'm not able to be there in person. It seems like you've had a great event today. Lots of important topics on the table, and I'm sorry I couldn't be part of the conversation. So I'm going to try to keep my talk relatively brief so we have time for Q&A and I can hear what you all have to say and respond to questions as best I can. So what I'm going to try to do in my talk today is give a sense of how I see our current historical moment, especially from a perspective of current events in the United States and their global impact. So the theme of my talk, I think, is well captured by the title, "Goodbye USA," which is a reference, as many of you probably know, to a famous essay that was written in Japan in 1885 by the philosopher Yukichi Fukuzawa, and that essay was entitled "Goodbye Asia." And this was the year when Fukuzawa basically wrote that for Japan to develop, it would have to abandon its Asian neighbors and have to really embrace the West. So a century before Mahathir Mohamad was telling all you Malaysians to look east, Fukuzawa was telling Japanese to look west. So the reason I use this title is because I think we're at a similar historical moment of a really serious geopolitical tectonic shift, which I think everyone is feeling and sensing as well. My starting point is probably a pretty obvious one, which is that the United States is no longer playing any kind of productive leadership role in the world, in Southeast Asia, or really anywhere in any meaningful way. And this, I think, holds true whichever main feature of liberalism that we're interested in talking about, whether we want to talk about the democracy side of liberalism or the trade side of liberalism. So whether we're talking about open politics or open markets, the United States is simply no longer playing any kind of leading role in upholding those globally. And so it's not entirely clear where the United States will land in all of this. The current president, of course, cannot remain president for eternity. But it does seem like, there are a few possibilities. One, at the moment, the United States has become sort of actively hostile to these principles of open politics, open markets. At a minimum, it's become entirely unpredictable. At other times, and I think more consistent with Americans' recent history, the United States is often just very uninterested in being very involved, particularly in places like Southeast Asia. So whether the United States winds up as mostly being hostile to, just unpredictable and erratic, or just uninterested in playing any kind of role in bolstering liberalism and democracy in the world. So I think we're in a new age. So so to the limited extent, and I do want to emphasize to the limited extent that the United States was ever really played any kind of pivotal role in strengthening democracy in Southeast Asia or really anywhere. Those days are almost certainly over. Depending on which subject area you're looking at, American prestige, American leadership are either being just unilaterally abandoned or just totally eviscerated, intentionally eviscerated by the current administration. So this doesn't mean that global democracy is over. It doesn't mean that global trade is over. It just means, from a Southeast Asian perspective, that Southeast Asian Democrats, like many of you in the room, are going to be going it alone even more now than ever before. But of course, the silver lining here is that America was never the decisive political democratizing factor in Southeast Asia to begin with. So how do we think about this current moment? So historically speaking, what I would suggest is what we're witnessing today is the end of what I'm calling a short liberal century that ran from 1945 to 2025. Now, that doesn't mean this. Of course, this is for fans of Eric Hobsbawm out there who know his books about Age of Revolution and Age of Empire. He likes to think in terms of these centuries, sometimes long centuries, sometimes short centuries. So when I say this was a liberal century, I do not mean, to be very clear, I do not mean it was exclusively liberal. I do not mean it was extremely liberal. All I'm saying is that those 80 years were more liberal than what preceded it. And I think will certainly be more liberal than what is following it now. And this age of relative liberalism was certainly grounded in American global hegemony. which, to be sure, was only consistently and very unreliably liberal in the first place. So there were enormous exceptions to any liberal rule one could try to imagine. So U.S. economic interests, U.S. security interests always came first in Washington. Um, but much of the time, if not most of the time, I think the self-interest, economic and security self-interest in the United States was understood in what Tocqueville would say, rightly self-interest rightly understood, which is that one's self-interest is best preserved by making sure others are doing well alongside you. And so I think the ethos really was that spreading wealth and security around the world was the best way to ensure American wealth and security. And at times, this also included a pretty active desire to spread democracy around the world as well. So this mantra, free markets and free elections, this was a sort of consistent bipartisan mantra in American foreign policy, running all the way from Truman to Biden. Um, and that market access, I think this is the bigger issue. This is one reason I put the tariffs photo here, um, because however one would grade America's history of promoting liberal politics and democracy, which is uneven at best, it's certainly true, I believe, that the market access that the United States began providing in the 1940s, after World War II, was really enormously important for particularly developing countries such as Malaysia. I think without question. And I think when you look around you in Asia, I think it's just this is I think just a fact that I think that Asia could not be as rich as it is today if America's import market was not as open as it was. So the fact that America's market is closing or becoming again only unpredictably open is really a major shock and a major change. But luckily, Malaysia, other Asian countries are much more prepared for that and are much wealthier and much more able to deal with that than they would have been 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So short liberal century is now over. So what does that mean? How do we think about prospects for democratic survival, transformation, and deepening in this sort of post American age, if you will? Um, and so again, to reiterate, so domestic factors have always predominated in Asian democratization. Malaysia, Indonesia, these pictures you're seeing. I mean, this is how democracy was gained in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. So in some ways, there's something there's maybe a silver lining, if you will, in the current moment, which is that to the extent that people had this illusion that the United States had played a central role in, bringing democracy to Asia or planting democracy in Asia, I think that illusion is now it can just hopefully nobody will buy it anymore. And I think that's true, not just in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, which have always been more distant from American power, but even in America's biggest Asian allies like Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. These are countries that built democracy on their own. And so it's simply not the case that this is some kind of American export in these places. And we could talk more about that in Q&A about why I see things that way. Um, so, so we have to look at domestic politics. And what I want to do with the rest of the talk is really talk about what domestic politics look like and how to think about democratic prospects in Southeast Asia. So, and here I think there are some important shifting winds. So I've argued recently that, in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, there was this major shift in Southeast Asia in which politics became as much about democracy as it became about development. So I think before the Asian financial crisis, kind of almost all politics was sort of reduced to these fights over development and trying to forge this consensus on economic development. And there was very little emphasis on how democratic or authoritarian these political systems were. But after the Asian financial crisis, with the reformasi movements in Malaysia, Indonesia, but more generally in the region, it became more of a balance. And I would say for the last quarter century or so, there's been more of a balance in the salience of development concerns and democracy concerns among Southeast Asian voters, Southeast Asian publics. And I think that what we're seeing now is democracy is back in the back seat. Development is back emphatically in the front seat. And there's a way in which it almost feels more like the 1980s when pressures for democracy seem to be paling next to pressure for and public concern for better economic performance. So politics seems to be getting reduced in a sense to development and less concern with democracy. I'd say in the aggregate in Southeast Asia as well, and that's not reducible to events in the United States. I think that there are reasons for that. That I mean, you could all tell me more about than I could tell you, but it would be worth talking more about. So in a sense, every democracy is out for itself at this point. There's no, and that's again, that's not entirely new, but I think it's just more emphatically the case. So how do we think about this? Let me provide sort of a way of thinking about democratic prospects in the region and what to watch for. So I want to propose a very, very simple structure for how to think about these things. So one way to think about what, people can talk about democracy as a set of values or a set of institutions or, these kinds of things. Um, I'm going to suggest we think about it in a simpler way, or I think it's a simpler way, which is think of democratization as the shift from one dominant power to a balance among multiple competing powers. Um, and this is it should be readily familiar or make perfect sense, I hope, to anyone listening in Malaysia, where get your image on the left here of the Barisan Nasional. I mean, Malaysia is going through a decade now of a transition from you know living under one dominant political power, the UMNO and the Barisan Nasional for somewhat good 60 years or so, uh, to a period where now there are multiple competing powers and there is no dominant power anymore. And the image on the right of the Philippines, you can see again, this is in the contemporary Philippines where you have this move to impeach Vice President Sara Duterte from supporters of Marcos, who's the president. So there's very clear, there's no single dominant power in the Philippines either. So if we think of it that way, I hopefully it simplifies things. And to be clear, sometimes the dominant power will kind of give way and allow more of a balance of power and allow more political competition under a lot of duress. And sometimes they do so because they're confident they can do so without having to close the political system. Um, but it's not necessarily the case that you want us to simply wait until an authoritarian regime introduces this. In places like Malaysia, in my view, UMNO and the BN did not ultimately kind of, they didn't reform; they just had to be defeated, and ultimately that was what led to the transfer of power in Malaysia. So let's think of this in terms of um, in a particular country in Southeast Asia. Is there one dominant power, or do we see more of a balance of power among multiple forces? So let's just talk this through for a few minutes here, and this will how I'll kind of try to get some ideas on the table for us to talk about. So we can kind of sort the region, I think, into countries where right now there is pretty clearly one dominant political power and one where there's more of a balance of power. And I put arrows up here as well to sort of indicate what's the direction line been, what's the trend line been, because these things are not equilibrium. These things shift. So if we start with the dominant power side of things, so these are the authoritarian regimes in Southeast Asia, or at least some of them. So we see in the top, I think the top three are all similar and somewhat interesting. So in Cambodia and in Myanmar and Thailand, these were all places that if you have say 15 years ago or thereabouts, these were all kind of systems that were opening to some degree. They were allowing electoral competition. They were old power elites were increasingly willing to share power with elected politicians. There was real electoral competition in a place like Cambodia. The ruling CPP was kind of on the verge of defeat. Not unlike the unknown to BN in elections around the same time in Malaysia. Um, but in all three of these places, we've seen a real increased closure. And this is why the arrows are moving toward dominant power here, right? So Cambodia has become essentially a single party system again, in line with its single party socialist tradition. Myanmar, the coup in 2021 has brought the military back and just crushed all sorts of civilian power. Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy are completely on the out. In Thailand, the military and the monarchy are experimenting with some electoral reforms, but they very quickly reverse them at any moment. So these are all three, and I think it's worthwhile noting the geography of this, that these three major mainland Southeast Asian cases are all experiencing this kind of authoritarian closure in recent years. Now, Vietnam as well, I think it's always just been a single party system, but there too, I think you're seeing increased, a stronger grip of leadership there, not unlike what's been happening in China. So there too, I think you've got again autocratic deepening happening as well. I think the one place in Southeast Asia where an autocracy is not necessarily deepening is probably Singapore. where certainly over the course of decades, the position of opposition has improved. The PAP is still a dominant party, but there's a growing, at least getting closer to a balance of power such that one could imagine it's not hard at all, I think, to imagine Singapore becoming more fully democratic in the decades to come. So then on the democratic side of things, so Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and so again geographically, notice we're moving from the mainland to the islands of Southeast Asia here, with Singapore as the exception. So Indonesia, of course, democratized in the wake of the Reformasi protests of 1998. And one reason I have the arrow going to the left here is because there has been this increasing elite closure of politics in Indonesia in recent years. So this is both because the presidencies of Jokowi and Prabowo are just simply stronger presidencies than the one that preceded them. So there's less of a sense that there's a balance of power between parliament and different parties. And most worrisomely in Indonesia is the fact that these presidents have encountered basically no elite opposition whatsoever. And what that means is they can kind of do what they want, and regardless of how voters vote, politicians all just sort of agree to share power. And what that means is that you essentially get a kind of dominant power block, or a cartel, as I've called it in Indonesia, which is running. So even though Indonesia is formally still a democracy, there's a way in which political competition has really been dramatically reduced over the past decade or so. So Indonesia is trending back toward a dominant power pattern, and democracy is really, really weakening, and perhaps even really no longer has a solid footing. So I'll go to the Philippines next, so I can end with Malaysia. So the Philippines, I think here, under Duterte, again, you had the rise of a kind of dominant power politics. And Duterte, just like Jokowi and like Prabowo, managed to basically get political support from the entire ruling elite. So there was really no real opposition to Duterte when he was to Rodrigo Duterte when he was in office. But now things are opening up again. There's this split between the Marcos family and the Duterte family, as in the slide I showed earlier. And so you're seeing a kind of, again, a balance of power between different clans, different factions, different families, which again is maybe not great for democratic performance, but at least it prevents any single dominant power from shutting things down. So in Malaysia as well, I think that's a similar story, in the sense that, again, many, many decades of hegemonic, single party, single coalition rule has been replaced with what you have now in Malaysia, which is a bit unwieldy, and it's a bit messy, and but is more of a balance of power. The government in power doesn't seem to have the prospects for or interest in trying to develop a monopoly on power at all. And I think, at this point, again, there are many reasons why we can be skeptical about or worried about Malaysian democracy. But I would just want to put this basic idea on the table to say, to the extent democracy requires this rough balance of power among different forces, and the prevention of one dominant power rising from dominating the whole political system, Malaysia is actually one of the more optimistic cases in the region. I think there's strong reason to believe that will remain the case. So what should we be watching out for? I think that where we've seen those movements to the dominant power side of things, where we've seen these balances of power break down, it's where you have really severe elite conflict. And to some extent, this is about political polarization too. But I'm going to argue elite conflict is the more important way to understand this. So again, go back to those examples of Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar that I mentioned. All had become kind of hybrid regimes. Or even, I think pretty substantial democracy in Thailand's case. And they've all really moved toward much more closed systems dominated by the military in Thailand and in Myanmar, and by the ruling CPP party and the Hun Sen dynasty, who you see on the left here in Cambodia. So these are cases where I think if elite conflict becomes unmanageable, or if political polarization, as in Thailand, becomes really severe, it really kind of creates this opportunity for either an interventionist military, as in Thailand or Myanmar, or for a dominant party which fears its own defeat to basically clamp down. And this is not unlike what happened under Najib, right? I mean, as the BN got closer to defeat, its initial reaction was not to become more liberal, but to become more closed, to become more repressive. So, and again, through the force of votes and civil society and mobilization, Malaysian Democrats and people who believed in pluralism in Malaysia were able to push through that. But in Cambodia, they weren't. And in Cambodia, the regime was able to seize pretty much total single party power. So I think as we think about Malaysia, this is the last thing I'll note. Another reason to be optimistic about Malaysia, or to feel like at least some form of this kind of democracy can survive, is that Malaysia does not have a powerful and politicized military. So Thailand and Myanmar are very clear examples where, when the military sees its role as political and it has and it's really a major powerful force, its intervention is the kind of quickest and clearest way that democracy can die. And so that's an advantage to Malaysia. And so here I think that the Cambodian example is the most interesting one, because Cambodia does not have a very powerful and politicized military. And so the fact that Hun Sen was able to basically close down a shop, kill off the competitive aspects of Cambodia's competitive authoritarian regime, was able to do so through his dominant party and through his control of the security apparatus and the police and the like. This I think is a clear model for something similar to what did happen in Malaysia in about a little over a decade ago, and could happen again, particularly if the current opposition in Malaysia were to return to power. But then again, a final note I'll see here, I think that and another reason maybe for some kind of optimism, I think geography does matter. It is, striking to me that right now the countries on Southeast Asia's mainland, so Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar, are becoming substantially more autocratic. Autocracy is really deepening. And in the islands of Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, maybe even Singapore, the trend is more toward more pluralism, more openness, elections really mattering, and there being real space for political opposition to operate. So I don't know why that is. I think we could kind of think about that collectively, possibly, but it is a striking geographic pattern in Southeast Asia, and it does lend maybe some more confidence. There's something about the political systems of island Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, that are making them less liable to be kind of shut down by dominant political parties or militaries. So I'm going to stop there and try to open things up to the audience. So any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Firstly, you can hear me, right? Okay, great. Thank you for the yes. Okay. So actually, thank you for the I would say very concise the very concise presentation that you gave, and which I think gives us a nice, it is almost a nice closure to what we've discussed throughout the day. So, if I may just kind of point out some of the key points that I liked in your speech, and that I would like to ask you further about before we go into, there's some questions on Slido already. Firstly, I like the point that you made about how Southeast Asians now need to go at it alone. That's the first point, and I feel that this is an interesting point because, I mean, just sharing the experience from Malaysia, I feel like Malaysia has always needed a role model or a model to look up to when it comes to liberal democracy, independent institutions. Pre 2018, we've always, the Commonwealth parliamentary system that we inherited meant that we did look up to the UK a lot on how our institutions can be robust and independent. And then post 2018, especially working in civil society, there was so much interest by America, by the Europeans, on helping us to navigate this new Malaysia, the new multi-party democracy that we got after 2018. So, I guess my first question to you is, can Malaysia really go at it alone? But who does Malaysia really then look up to now that America, is no longer that example of how a liberal democracy uh, should be should be carried out? So that's my first question then.
Okay. I mean, I think that the my main answer is to look up to yourselves. I think that I mean the reason I became a democracy scholar, was because I was living in Malaysia in 1998 and saw what the Reformasi movement looked like up close. And what I saw in that was a kind of courage and a kind of political commitment that I had really never gotten to witness, in the United States, where people I think took the democratic, rights and institutions they had for granted. So I don't think you need to look up to anybody anywhere. I think of places like Malaysia, what's happened in South Korea recently, I think is also should be an inspiration, if not a role model. I mean, the fact that when the president in South Korea tried to do a coup and tried to shut things down, and society resisted and made it basically impossible for it to succeed. I mean, there are great examples in Asia. I mean, democracy. A point I make in my most recent book. I mean, democracy is not Western. There's nothing Western about democracy. Democracy is something that can happen anywhere, and anywhere where people are willing to fight for it, and want to see it happen. And again, and even in places where people don't have, even when your leaders don't have very democratic values, just that there's a balance of power among them. So I would say, that there are certainly cases around the world that are thriving and that one could look at. I think, even within the Commonwealth, one could look at a place like, I mean, Canada, I think is clearly doing a lot better than the United States is in terms of its democracy right now. I think there are lots of places we can look and say, oh, there's not so much to look up to anybody, but just to say we're not alone. And this is something that can be done, and it can be done, and it can be sustained for long periods of time. So hopefully this could be a moment to, for Malaysians to feel proud about what they've built, what they've accomplished. Recognizing, all of the flaws and the difficulties and the disappointments of the current political system. But hopefully there's a certain sense that what's been built should be cherished and improved and sustained. And certainly, I'm envious as an American to look on and see, you have a government that I think at least is sort of, broadly committed to the welfare of its people and to, sustain democracy. That's not how things feel in the United States right now. So I'm looking up to you.
Thank you, Dan. That's such an encouraging note. Just one more from me regarding the presentation. So, another thing that you mentioned that was interesting and echoes some of the previous panel discussions, some of the points of the previous panels were talking about was how democracy at the back seat and development at the front seat was something that you mentioned. And this resonates, I think, because in one of the earlier, I think in the plenary discussion this morning, we were talking about so much of the faith in liberal democracy has eroded because it's perceived to not deliver results. And perhaps many people out there are happy that development is the one that's taking the front seat. And democracy is has been relegated to the back. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is true in America too. I mean, a lot of the argument about why, why Harris lost, the Biden Harris administration, I mean, for all its, I think a lot of successes in economic policy is people felt like inflation was bad, and people felt like cost of living was a problem, and like, okay, they want to change the government. So I think in Malaysia too, my sense is people really get very focused on cost of living concerns, and these have sort of taken the place of the kind of more, maybe, I don't know, if they're abstract or if they're more high-minded or something. But these concerns with things like justice, the word on everybody's lips in 1998 was justice. Right. It was not cost of living. That wasn't why people were out in the streets opposing the Mahathir regime. So yeah, it's something that I think it's global. I think that there's people have this expectation that democracy is supposed to produce economic miracles or something like that. I think that the thing that's hard and has to be sustained is some sense that people understand that democracy matters because it's democracy, because of the ways that it allows people to live a life of some at least limited freedom of coercion and illicit non-legal repression by the state apparatus. presumably, under democracy, that most people shouldn't just be, locked up and put away when nobody knows where they are, which is one reason why America is not a democracy today. Because if you look at what ICE agents are doing around the streets of the United States right now, it's a total horror show. Um, and so I just think they're different. I just think they're different concerns. I think that we can value development and we can value democracy and we can try to, you know, fight for institutions that further both of them. But the fact that one is concerned about development or feels like development is maybe not as doing as well as they'd like doesn't seem to be a reason to cast aside, democracy. So hopefully we can develop a discourse. And those of us who support democracy can support and try to forge a collective narrative that kind of can say, of course, development matters, and of course, your cost of living matters, and of course, these things are important, but they're not the only thing that matters. And there are people beside yourself who are writers and journalists and dissidents and activists and university students and people who really really deserve to have a right to free speech and free assembly and to be able to engage in the life that they want to live. And so even if you're not an activist or a student or a journalist, it's worth defending those things for your neighbors and for other people in your country and around the world in other countries. Hopefully we're all going to stay concerned with events in other countries too and not become parochial either.
Thank you, Dan. I want to read out a question from Slido, from Wen Tao from from NTU actually. The question is: Southeast Asia carries a lot of legacy of family politics, as you shared in your presentation, where they use democratic means to return to power. How can this curse be broken? That's the question.
That's a very good question. I think this is something where it's got to be changes in broader society. So there's just this question of, societies really vary by how much in terms of resources, lies in the hands of a few small families or a ruling party. You remember this not long ago in Malaysia. And so really you've got to develop that kind of the economic strength, collective strength, organizational strength outside of those families. So and it's very very hard. I mean, even very wealthy societies like Japan, like the United States, I've still really really serious problems with dynastic politics and this kind of family politics. So I think one one blessing I think both Malaysia and Singapore have, in a sense, is that they really do have strong institutions as well. They're not only, as in a way, like, a place like, the Philippines to a large degree has really been always plagued by, weak political institutions and, what one of my professors once called an anarchy of families. And so that's not the case in Malaysia or in Singapore or in Indonesia for that matter. So I do think there are organizations you can join. There are, there are different ways of acting collectively outside of family politics that can provide a counterbalance to those things. And trying to organize and raise resources and speak out about these things and call attention to these things, you can at least chip away at it. I don't think there's any magic pill which allows you to get rid of dynastic politics altogether. In fact, I can't think of a case where that's happened, or someone who's tried as a social scientist to theorize how you actually end, like to really answer your question. How do you actually end this? I don't know anyone's ever figured that out. So I think you chip away and you build up something, and it's in the negative space around that family politics, and then hopefully that can over time just grow and take on more and more of the space that exists.
Thank you, Dan. It is 2:45 p.m. here in KL, so to ensure that people are not falling asleep, I do want to ask if anyone wants to come up to the microphone to ask a question. You're most welcome to. We have one, two. Yes, please, sir. You can use the microphone next to you. Yeah, just a short introduction of your name as well. Thank you.
Hello. Oh, there you go. Okay. Um. Good. Good afternoon, doctor. My name is Nathaniel, and I have a question. Pretty much related, actually. A bit of context is needed. In Malaysia, we assume that when a political party captures a majority of the legislature's seats, and the bigger the majority they have, the more stable the government is, and therefore that is a necessity for national development and progress. I explained this to my friend from Norway, and he was surprised because for the last 40 years, Norway has been led by multiple minority governments that didn't command the majority of the legislature. But that didn't stop Norway from becoming a model to other countries and having progressive initiatives like the Sovereign Wealth Fund that they're famous for. So my question is, should we rethink the idea that a government with a majority is a necessity for national development and progress? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm glad you're thinking comparatively here, and I'm glad you're having these conversations with people from other, because this is the thing. This is not back to Ida's question, right? This is not about looking that someone is down and looking up at somebody else. This is about, well, here's Malaysia's experience, here's Norway's experience. What can we learn from each other? What might be possible? And so I assure you that Malaysia could teach you teaching your Norwegian friend a lot about what activism looks like and what bravery in the face of authoritarian repression looks like. Because a lot of these democracies around the world are becoming much more repressive, and they're closing up space for civil society. So hopefully the lessons will go both ways. I think that's a great conversation to have. I think that there is a kind of there's sort of, I think, a stability bias in Southeast Asian politics. There are really good concerns, historical reasons to fear what happens when things get unstable. And particularly in Malaysia, like what happens when elections are too close? What happens when they're contested? Does that lead to conflict? And I think in America as well, I think part of the reason America has spiraled downward in part is because things are so tight, they're so close, that parties are always afraid of losing elections, and they think if they, like what you just saw in Texas, if we gerrymander things, if we disenfranchise more people, make it a little harder to vote, like it's going to make this difference. So in some ways, this this is the paradox of what I was talking about at the beginning, this balance of power idea. So it is true that a balance of power, and this is what to watch out for in Malaysia, I think, a balance of power is very conducive to democracy in the sense that there is no one dominant force. But when things are very evenly split, that also can strongly motivate more authoritarian actors to try to cheat and to try to use repression or fraud or whatever other tools at their disposal to try to close down democratic space and make sure that they win. So there's something both promising and perilous in this kind of moment that we're seeing in Malaysia. And I would say, yes, that I agree with your friend. It's not essential to have some kind of supermajority to rule in a stable way. It's okay to have a robust parliament. It's okay to have robust opposition. Malaysia has, I think, has had that more than Indonesia has. I think that's a healthy thing. I think that's one of the better legacies of a Westminster British tradition, is that there's a natural way in which government, it's government versus opposition. That's not how things work in Indonesia, and I think the British legacy has something to do with that. So, I think more willingness to suffer through non-supermajority government and functioning in that way, and realize the point I made to Ira in the last question. Let's just not think of democracy and development as something that necessarily goes together, right? Whether or not you're going to be rich is not all about how democratic you are, right? Whether you're democratic or not isn't necessarily dependent on how rich you are. They're different things. So making democracy function and making the economy function are two. They're not totally disconnected, but they're also not reducible to the other. So we have to think about politics and democracy as its own thing, and its own phenomenon.
Can I? Okay. Thank you, Dan. This is a great question from Nathaniel and great answer. Anyone else on the microphone? Yes, Chinhua, please go ahead.
Hi. Good morning, Professor Slater. Chinwat from Sunway University. My question is on your assessment of Thailand moving toward the directions of a dominant party. While Thaksin Thai party is now being weakened, having lost its sixth prime minister since Thai time. But what's your take on the rise of the orange color third force from Future Forward Party, Move Forward Party, and now People Party, which interestingly has managed to eat into the territories of both Thaksin in the north and northeast, as well as the establishment parties in Bangkok, winning highest numbers of votes and seats on party list constituency. Thank you.
Yeah, great. No, I'm glad you bring up the Thai. Thailand's such an interesting case. I just wrote a piece in the Journal of Democracy. I know Ira was talking about sharing some written work. There is a new essay I have, if you'd be interested, that takes this on. So I think Thailand is in some ways an exception to this claim that democracy is in the back seat and development is now swamping all concerns with democracy. That's not how young Thai voters see it. Young Thai voters, especially urbanites, but the young are really, really like Malaysian voters and youth, a decade ago, really mobilizing against this, and being willing to vote against this power monopoly that's held by the military and the monarchy and its allies in the political parties. And so you're seeing a real, almost, I think, revolutionary demand among Thai citizens to say, we are sovereign. The people are sovereign, not just the king. This is not just the king country. It belongs to the people. And again, I'm sorry if this is a touchy subject in Malaysia, but right, you can have a monarchy, but that doesn't have to deny popular sovereignty. And in Thailand it has, in Malaysia it hasn't. So I think in some ways the Thailand, Malaysia, how the monarchy works and how it can play a constructive role, without swamping out democracy is what we were thinking about. So no, the rise of Future Forward is enormously important. As you see, this government in Thailand has zero tolerance essentially to let it actually, enjoy the powers that it's won through the votes that it's won. And this is why I'm suggesting this is another case where things have moved from more open to more closed. What we're seeing now, and what I just recently wrote about, is that I think essentially that Putai, the party of the Shinawats, is, if not finished, at least deeply weakened. And what that means is that this era of sort of populism and anti-populism in Thailand, I guess I heard populism was a big topic of discussion earlier today. Sorry I missed it. But in Thailand, I think this age of what I've called careening, or this conflict between populists and oligarchs and anti-populism, I think that might be at an end. Because you notice when the phone call was leaked and the prime minister was again exposed for this kind of very obsequious phone call with Hun Sen, the yellow shirts all came out, the anti-Thaksin forces all came out to mobilize and protest. But I think for the first time, maybe it was the first time, but the first time I can remember, there was no red shirt response. It was just the one side. And that really suggests to me that the Shinawats might be pretty close to finished. And then that leads to the question of like this clash between Future Forward and the military and the monarchy. And I guess what I would say, my view on this is there's this real irony, which is that, it's the more you try to close down space, the more democracy becomes what people care about. So in Thailand, again, this is something where, why is democracy in the front seat? Because it's being denied. So even just mild political reforms and opening in Thailand, I think, could lead people to think, again, put development back in the front seat, as in Malaysia. In Malaysia, you finally have the democratic breakthrough, development's back in the front seat. So I think it's just unwise for these authoritarian regimes to try to shut things down the way that they are, because it's only making society more restive and more focused on the kinds of democracy concerns that these regimes don't want to talk about and think about, as opposed to the development concerns that the regimes do want to be thinking about. But Thailand, again, a very inspiring case. Another reason why you don't need to look very far to find inspiration and allies. Again, let's maybe stop looking up to anybody. Let's look for inspiring allies and people who have fought fights that we're fighting and who've been successful. And they haven't been successful yet, but I think, but again, certainly in terms of mobilizing a winning majority in elections, So looking at how Future Forward mobilized youth voters would, I think, be a great lesson possibly for Malaysian political parties. Like, what was it that they did to really swing youth? Because youth are turning more conservative and more anti-democratic in more and more parts of the world. So Thailand is really a place to watch. Like, how have they prevented that?
Thank you, Dan. Any other questions from the floor, please? Yes. Just a short introduction to yourself and then into your question. Thank you.
Yeah. My question is, do you see democracy, liberalism actually a threat to national sovereignty, nation state, the very entity that we created to keep the system going? Thank you.
I definitely do not. I think that if you go back to, let's go back to 1848 in the part of Europe where I am right now, I'm in Berlin, where, there were huge protests in 1848. And the idea was, nationalism and democracy started to work together. The idea became that, to be a sovereign nation required a sovereign people, and not just political elites, not just a monarchy. And so I think that it's only once, the people actually gained at least a very big share of sovereignty. This is not to say people should be abolishing monarchies. I'm not calling for any abolishing of monarchy. All I'm saying is that the monarch shouldn't hold all the sovereignty to themselves. And so I think the popular role is very, very important. And the more democratically it's exercised, the more you build a genuine nation of all its people. So I think that's a vital part of what it means to build a modern nation state, is for the people and their sovereignty to come to the forefront. And sometimes that's democracy, and sometimes it comes through revolution. I think I think in a place like China, I mean, China is certainly a repressive political system, but there's also a sense that the people have a kind of sovereignty that was gained through the revolution, which is meaningful, and it makes it a different kind of place than if it's certainly. It's not authoritarian in the sense that the old like the Qing dynasty was, right? It's a very different kind of system. So the people having some kind of forward role and sovereign stake in the nation, I think, is part of what makes a nation complete.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You can use that mic. Don't forget to introduce yourself. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can speak into the mic.
Hi, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I'm from University Malaya. Since today morning, we're discussing a lot about liberalism under siege. We also discussed about erosion of trust on institutions, etc., right? My question, I want to take you back to very theoretical and conceptual foundation. And since we're talking about the erosion of trust, etc., I want to understand maybe what do you think about this in the context, like, since democracy or liberalism, how we discuss about how realistic is the idea of liberalism, we're discussing that, and the erosion of trust in democracy, then perhaps do you think in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, whichever region, are we giving that scope? Say, for example, a kind of borrowing from other models like state-led development from China, or even the ideological penetration from China. So what do you think about this theoretical or conceptual gap which is building up with the US retrenchment? Yeah.
No, really interesting. I love that you guys are having these conversations. Again, I wish I could have been part of them, just to be able to listen and learn from you all. I guess I'd say, that trust in institutions. So I think that it's not so bad to be distrustful of institutions, and certainly of the politicians who run them. I think that in a healthy democracy, politicians, they're elites and they get to have nice cars and they get to have a lot of status, but they're accountable to you. They're accountable to the citizens. And they should be viewed with a kind of mistrust, and a kind of active mistrust of them. Now, that is a different, I think, than a kind of cynicism about the need for institutions. So you do need institutions to function, to make you also need to make authoritarianism work. I mean, politics doesn't work, the economy doesn't work without effective institutions. So one has to appreciate the necessity for functioning institutions without giving some kind of blanket trust to the politicians or bureaucrats who command those institutions and who run these things. So it's actually kind of paradoxical. As you're asking the question, it's paradoxical to me, right? So as people, this idea of losing trust in democracy, right? So when people say they're losing trust in democracy, what they generally mean is they're losing trust in politicians, right? Which, fair enough. I don't like politicians any more than anybody else does. But the irony is that if you move to a more authoritarian system, you're just giving politicians more unchecked power. So the idea that if you feel like democracy isn't working and you feel like politicians aren't responsive and you feel like you don't trust them, that's not a reason to get rid of democracy. That's your only chance to have any power over these politicians in the first place. So I think that the real problem here is that I think we're all not educated enough, but we certainly don't have strong enough education systems, certainly in the United States, to make citizens aware of how important institutions are. Because then what you get is people saying utterly absurd things like, I alone can fix it, which is something the current American president says, and something you had a prime minister not that long ago who would say things like that. I alone can fix it. I work as I work as a team, as Mahathir once put it. Like, yeah, you personally, you are the team. Individuals can't make these things work. Institutions have to be functioning. So people will throw their lot in with, well, this person's charismatic, or they seem like they have a lot of energy, and so let's trust them rather than institutions. That's a really, really dangerous way for things to go. And this is why I think that the problem with populism, and again, I'm sorry I missed these conversations, the problem with populism isn't that it's anti-elite. I mean, we're all anti-elite. Everybody should be anti-elite. I mean, elites are problems. Elites, they hoard their power. They hoard their money. Of course, everybody should be anti-elite. The issue is, are you anti-institutions? Do you not actually want to work through institutions to try to curb elite power? Do you try to entrust some strong man to try to somehow curb that kind of elite power? And I think that's really the issue. So I guess the short answer to my long answer, but my short conclusion to your really good question is, trust in institutions is good, but not in the people who run them, and know the difference and realize why institutions have to be defended.
Thank you. Go ahead, Helmi, and this will be the last question that I will take. I have to close the session after this.
Hello,
Go ahead.
greetings, Prof. Just one question. What are your thoughts on liberal democracy absorbing actual or credible grievances raised by populism without actually compromising any of its core values or tenets, meaning like freedom and all that? I mean, populism raises really valid questions, and how does in the future liberal democracy actually takes part and address those issues, therefore solve the society's needs? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. No more questions after this. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, well, that's a terrific question, and we struggle with these things. I think there are a couple of different camps here. I think one camp says that it's important for progressive forces to minimize, tamp down, de-emphasize, quote unquote, identity politics, things like racial equality, gender equality, equality for LGBTQ, rights for immigrants, these kinds of things, as a way of sort of, as a kind of softener, and therefore take away some of the support from the far right. And I know you heard, about your discussion about Germany this morning. Super interesting case where these are real dilemmas. Do you take some part of the AFD's platform, or if you take some part of the Republicans' platform, if you're a Democrat in the United States, you take some part of the opposition's platform, if you're the government in Malaysia right now, just to try to soften support. And this is a very, very dangerous, kind of game to play. And I think there are some responses that are more fruitful and more virtuous than others. I think the main thing to try to do is try to address populist concerns with the economy. the main point is people are getting left behind. There's real economic decline, particularly in rural areas, and need to have some kind of active, agenda to address that is just vital. And that's just the right thing to do anyway. I'm very, very, hesitant about and skeptical of anyone who would sort of say that there needs to be an abandonment of the principles of on more cultural grounds of equality that are really, really belated, that have come way, way too late. Things like gender equality, things like protection for sexual minorities, things like the decent, humane treatment of refugees and immigrants. I think these are just non-negotiables. I really do, and I think that I would much rather see progressive forces just make a better case for these things, and try to compete on these things and to argue and show that these are human beings like you, and they're not demanding something that you don't have. It's just about this is about base decency. And I do hope that we can have kind of a muscular politics of decency and of universal rights, that can be more economically inclusive and more aware and less, tone deaf and blind to the very real problems that, people without college education and that people in rural areas especially really, really face in this current version of the economy that we have. So I hope we can respond in those ways without sacrificing what I hope will remain core principles. And I think, and maybe I'll end with this point, is that, liberalism, this is the theme of your conference, right? Liberalism looks very different in different parts of the world. Malaysian liberalism is not like American liberalism. And one thing about Malaysian liberalism that I've always, it's always struck me is that so much of it is focused on making sure that minorities are not treated like second-class citizens, and that people who maybe are more have a more relaxed view on religious strictures or on other kinds of traditional authorities are able to live with can live their true lives and be their true selves. And I think that in some ways the kind of liberalism that I've seen in a place like Malaysia is wrapped up in identity politics in a way that's unavoidable. And I guess here's where I'm looking up to you, because I think in America, where we could maybe trick ourselves into saying, oh, well, if we take care of the economic problem, that makes the race problem go away. That makes the gender problem go away. That makes the sexual discrimination problem go away. Guess what? It doesn't. Those are not just economic problems. The kind of identity-rich liberalism, the kind of culturally rich liberalism that I see in a place like Malaysia and in Indonesia as well, are, I think, inspirations for me in how to make sure that liberalism in America is not only about, well, it's just a little bit more redistribution, and then these other deep forms of chronic entrenched inequalities will just go away, because they won't. And because ultimately liberalism has to be an ideology that is working not to reinforce inequalities, which I think it unfortunately has. Neoliberalism has completely reinforced and worsened inequalities. So the next version of liberalism has to be attentive to and figure out how to reduce inequality.
Thank you so much, Dan. On that optimistic note, unfortunately, we'll have to end your keynote. So thank you so much for joining us. Can everyone just give a round of applause for our keynote speaker? Thank you very much to Professor Dan Slater. I'm hopeful that you can hopefully join us in person, maybe for our next Liberalism or 11th Liberalism conference next
I
year.
hope so. I hope so. I'll save the date. Send me the calendar. I'll save the date.
Will do. Hope your trip in Berlin will be a good one. Thank you so much.